Good morning and afternoon to those joining our event today. Our conversation will ask what I think is one of the most fundamental questions in international political economy, and that is, can capitalism rise to the occasion to combat climate change? This question comes at a time when world leaders are meeting in Davos, Switzerland. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen over the weekend, or I think yesterday, announced the EU's Net Zero Industry Act, which is intended to counter the US climate subsidies passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Transatlantic spending on climate efforts is in part, of course, predicated on this idea that growth is good, or that growth will lead to more and better outcomes over time. This also coincides with the growing popularity of a new movement, the degrowth movement, which very simply put disagrees with those assumptions and disagrees with the presumption that limitless growth and a healthy climate can coexist. So as leaders around the world assess their approach to climate change, countries have also begun to rethink some of the fundamental aspects of economic growth, international trade, and global cooperation as we know it. It is therefore a distinct pleasure to welcome today virtually to CSIS, Alessio Terzi, who will walk us through some of these topics. Alessio is the author of Growth for Good, Reshaping Capitalism to Save Humanity from Climate Catastrophe, which was released just last year. He's also an economist at DG ECFIN in the European Commission, a lecturer at HEC in Paris and Sciences Po. He previously was an affiliate with Bruegel and a Fulbright scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School. He obtained a PhD from the Hertie School, an MPA in Economic Policy from LSE, and a BSc in International Economics from Bocconi University in Italy. Alessio and I are also joined by my CSIS colleague, Stephanie Siegel. She's a senior fellow with the economics program here, where she works on climate finance mobilization, international financial institutions, and a host of other economic topics. She previously served at the Department of Treasury and IMF. Today, we will begin by inviting Alessio to make brief remarks about his book, to provide an overview of his key findings and arguments, after which Stephanie and I will ask him a series of questions. With our remaining time, we will turn to the audience for Q&A. We invite you in the meantime to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to monitor that and make note of questions as they come in. So with that, let me please pass the floor over to Alessio. We welcome your thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Emily, Stephanie, and CSIS more broadly for the kind invitation and for the introduction. I guess you asked me to give a short introduction. I mean, I suppose that a lot of people in the audience have not read the book, and so I just wanted to give an extremely brief taste of what the book is about, and I guess we can then flesh out more of it in our discussion later on. And to my mind, this is a book that started as a reflection on the concept of economic growth. Bear in mind that I've done a PhD in economic growth, and I've realized at the end of it, when I started my reflection to write this book, that I knew very little about it. Which maybe tells something about the dire state of economics or publishing in economics. But it started as a question of what is economic growth, and the reason why I was interested in this is, of course, placed within the context we're in right now, which is a reality where we know that we have to improve our relationship with nature, with the natural world more broadly, and fight climate change. And to many, there is a dichotomy there. For a long time, and for economists, it is obvious that economic growth is something good, and that this is something that you want to pursue. And again, part of my PhD was on looking at measures you could take, reforms and your fiscal policy and so on to boost growth. So growth is always seen as a target, and generally then you look at how to foster it. And then what I did with this book was to take a step back and wonder, but is it a good target? In order to answer that, you've got to answer a broader question, which is what is growth? And how does it relate to nature? And in the moment in which we need to improve our relationship with nature, can we do that while continuing to pursue growth? And in order to do that, I've realized when talking to fellow authors of books that people generally decide what they want to say when planning to write a book, and then they sort of build a book around it, build the arguments around it. This is not how this book was born. And actually, for those of you who will choose to read it, you've read it already, you might have realized that it is a bit of a question and answer process. So I ask a question, I answer it, and then the next chapter, this opens another question, I try to answer it, which is why the book ends up being very broad, because you rapidly realize that in trying to answer the question of what growth is, you tap into things that have been debated and discussed for centuries, millennia to a certain extent. You can go back to Plato and a discussion on whether, material goods and non-material needs, or what is better and what is not, what is a need, what is a want. These are things that we've been discussing as humanity forever, effectively. And that is what this relates to. It relates to things like innovation. What is the link between innovation and servicing human needs and wants? It relates to human nature itself, because it ultimately forces you to reflect on whether this desire for better, for more, for improving our condition as humans is something that is inbuilt in us. But I don't want to pretend that this is a super abstract book that goes back to Plato's time, and rather reflecting my double or triple personality as a bit of an academic, a bit in policy making, think tank experience, and so on. You will see in the book that these triple personalities are reflected in the sense that then I try to convert first order principles or broader reflections in an agenda for change. And so what this means when we go into a more policy discussion and how can we credibly fight climate change, foster the decarbonization wave that we need. To your interest and the interest of our audiences today, this all led me to a reflection on maybe more the geopolitics of the green transition. Of course, because there is this idea that climate change is a global problem, therefore it requires a global solution. And again, I tried to analyze a bit first principles in order to conclude or to draw some thoughts on what is the credible level of cooperation that we can expect on climate change, and whether in light of that credible level, it is still possible to achieve the decarbonization we need and reaching net zero broadly by mid-century, which is what climate science tells us we need to do. And then there is a final discussion towards the end of the book on effectively turning the question around, in the sense that I often, when I speak to mainstream fellow economists, what they will tell me is, we need to do this decarbonization wave for a variety of reasons, maybe ethical, and so on. But at the end of the day, this is going to be broadly neutral in the sense that, we're switching one energy source for another. We're switching, from internal combustion engine to electric vehicle. At the end of the day, they sort of do the same thing. And so, this is not a growth strategy, which is what Ursula von der Leyen, for example, she presented the Green Deal. So the decarbonization strategy of the European Union was presented as Europe's new growth model. And what instead fellow economists would say is, you're overplaying this and you're promising that this is going to be a growth strategy to people when this is not, it's going to be neutral. And in the final part of the book, I try to answer this question saying, look, what we are trying to spark here is something that is close to a green industrial revolution, given by the fact that we're having to reinvent the whole of production, consumption, transport, housing, agriculture, everything. And so if we look for historical parallels, what is probably the closest historical parallel is to industrial revolutions. And so, maybe on aggregate at world level, it will be neutral, but I would argue that there will be some winners and there will be some losers in terms of based on the fact that comparative advantages will be recast across the globe and across sectors, companies, technologies. And as a result, you can't just assume that this is a neutral transition. And that's why governments, I would argue, are taking all the policy measures that we are going to discuss later on to try and make sure that they end up on the winning end of this transformation. And I will stop here to open the discussion.
Well, thank you for those thoughts. I think before we get into some of the solutions that you just outlined, which essentially boil down to a fundamental rethink of the way that we go about capitalism and designing our global economy, I would love to hear more about your thoughts on the degrowth movement itself, what it is, how it relates to climate change and economics. And then I think one thing that was particularly interesting that you note in the book is that degrowth is particularly popular with younger people. I think you mentioned that half of millennials and Gen Z are dissatisfied with the current economic order, but it's not only relegated to that age group. I think the Pope, KPMG directors, physics Nobelists, others have really bought into this idea of degrowth. So if you could just say a couple of words about what the movement is and what it portends for our discussions of capitalism, I think that would be helpful to our audience.
Yes, so in the book, I try to do something that is a bit risky in the sense that one of the early chapters is really taking degrowth arguments, presenting them, explaining them to audiences that not necessarily are familiar with them, and presenting them in a neutral way. And these are ideas with which then I will disagree eventually, but I present them in a neutral way because I think that they start from some fair questionings of our society, economic system, and the way in which we plan to address climate change. Now, degrowth is a broad term that collects a variety of literatures. Literatures that are often disconnected, not necessarily always internally coherent, but there are some standard tenets that appear constantly. And I would argue that the fundamental point is to say, look, maybe economic growth served a purpose early on in order to service needs, and so it led to the emergence out of poverty. But beyond a certain point, this growth is just feeding consumerism. It's not feeding real needs. Therefore, we don't need it anymore. And this is particularly the case in rich countries. And so rich countries should give up this obsession with more and with wanting more always, and just embrace principles of sufficiency. These are popular things. These are things that on the individual level we identify with minimalism, for example, which intuitively makes sense. And I think that a lot of the degrowth principles, and the reason why they're so popular, is that taken individually, many of the recommendations sound commonsensical, and they've persuaded many people of their validity. I would argue that if you go around and you ask a random person in Washington, D.C. whether, I don't know, you can have infinite growth on a finite planet, I would argue 90% of them, if they're not economists, would argue, yes, of course, you cannot have infinite growth. And so you take these first principles to conclude that you need, let's say, shrinking of the economies or steady state economy in rich countries, allow for poor countries to develop. We've got to get rid of all these extra things we have that are unnecessary, and instead focus on the stuff that matters, which in this case can be decarbonization. We need to reorient innovation. You cannot let companies do innovation, because then if not, they end up doing it in useless things, drawn by the desire for greater profits. And so you have to centralize innovation, do it much more government-led. And so people will embrace these principles of sufficiency and live sharing more. So there is also this idea of sharing more within societies, which again, I would argue is part of the reason why they're becoming more popular right now, when inequalities are growing in certain countries. Of course, the element of redistribution grows in an equal manner. And then there is a dimension that is more international, so you want greater sharing at global level as well. And so again, resources should flow from rich countries to poor countries to allow them to emerge from poverty, and to a certain extent to pay climate reparations or colonial reparations of sort.
Well, Alessio, let me pick up the conversation from there. And actually, let me just start by congratulating you on the book itself. I was mentioning to you earlier, this was my holiday read, and I took it on in preparation for this event. But I really found myself looking forward to that time that I could go off and continue to make progress in the book. I think it's really well done. And you described it, I guess, in completing the book, thinking of it as very broad. I thought of it as very ambitious and really interdisciplinary. You seem to approach the topic as an economist, but in trying to work out, I guess, the proof, you end up getting into issues of human psychology and really tapping into the psychology as a driver behind capitalism. So let me kind of pick up that thread and just ask you about, you come out with the strong recommendation that capitalism is the answer to the climate crisis. But I wonder if you could maybe explain that a bit. You've got 6 principles, I guess, that drive your conclusions, and the first of which is growth is imperative, and capitalism is the main mechanism for achieving that growth. But could you explain why growth is so imperative to answering the climate crisis?
Yes, so I guess the point where I depart from a degrowth type of argument or critique of the current system is to say, look, whereas to many people, the desire for more is an imposition of the system. So the critique would be built along the lines of, it is capitalism that is using these tools such as advertisement or planned obsolescence or whatnot, and all of these things are feeding people's desire for more, whereas people would be perfectly happy to just settle with what they have, and that's it. And that's the point of depart, and that's why I have to end up using a variety of literatures, also from psychology, taking examples from different civilizations, different points in time, well beyond the beginning of capitalism, to argue that actually the desire for more is something closer, I would argue, to an inbuilt feature of humans. And it is actually this combination of a desire for more and a capacity for developing ideas, come up with innovation technologies, develop so-called cumulative knowledge, so come together as groups of people sharing ideas and using those ideas, technologies in the service of improving our condition. That is what you can read the whole of human history as this dynamic taking place. You can read the invention of agriculture along these lines, the invention of clothing in order to move to higher latitudes, the use of fire, the early navigation in order to fish or trade or whatnot. So all of human history can be read along these lines. And that is why I argue that this idea that at some point you will magically persuade people to just settle with what they have is likely to spark all sorts of, unleash all sorts of negative dynamics, because you would design a system that goes against, let's say, human desires, and so ultimately people will just try to go around it. And so what I argue there is, it is not capitalism's fault per se, and again, this is a growingly unpopular opinion, but it is not capitalism per se that is at the heart of climate change or environmental degradation. It is the fact that for a long time we have treated nature as unlimited, and therefore we have used it without thinking too much about how we were affecting it and the consequences of this. But that is important to answer your question, because it means that we can use capitalism in order to address the challenge we have ahead. And the reason why I argue this would be a good idea is that although it has all sorts of negative features, the fact that there are growing inequalities is a bit inbuilt in the system. And so we're constantly trying to design policies in order to reduce these centripetal forces that capitalism has embedded in it, whether it is competition policy, whether it is taxation, redistribution, social benefits, and so on. So we're constantly trying to contain some of the negative features of capitalism, but one of the positive features is that it has proved to be a very effective machinery at fostering innovation. And what I argue is that what we're trying to do is, once more, we need to develop ideas, new ways of doing things in the service of human needs or wants, and the human need and want of the moment is to improve our relationship with nature. And so what I wonder in the book, or what I draw as a blueprint, is ways to reshape, reorient the machinery and make it an ally in our fight against climate change. And in the process, we will generate growth, because to my definition, growth is effectively innovation in the service of human needs and wants. It will be a different type of growth. If you want to follow, let's say, standard lingo, you can call it green growth, but it is a different type of growth with respect to the one we have seen over the past 150, 200 years in a fossil fuel era. And that's why I say growth, retaining growth is imperative.
Well, yeah, well, a couple of things, actually. One of the things I found really interesting in your book was the focus that you placed on kind of relative comparisons, and how much that is kind of a motivator for seeking more, for wanting more, is in large part driven by the relative comparison. So it matters what you're comparing to. The other thing that I really enjoyed kind of the discussion around luxury goods and essential items. And just for those that haven't read the book, you do a really good job of kind of tracing through what used to be considered luxury items becoming essential to the way that we live. So, lots of examples to draw on, but just a cell phone not that long ago within our lifetimes have gone from being, truly a luxury good to now a really basic tool that everyone needs to navigate their situation. And you think about kind of the economic growth that's implicit in producing, small computers that we all walk around with. So you have some really kind of tangible examples of this growth imperative that you're talking about. You said, your belief is that capitalism is the best system to foster innovation, but then you also acknowledge that the capitalism that you envision differs from a true kind of neoliberal, borderline laissez-faire version of capitalism. I'm wondering if you could provide some of the specifics of how you would tweak the capitalist model and where you see, let's call it kind of government interventions, I guess, coming into play.
I think what I try to argue is that maybe it's also a reflection of my age, in the fact that the only type of capitalism or discussion around capitalism that I've experienced since being interested in these topics, let's say, has been in a post-Washington consensus era. But I'm very fond of economic history, as you will have realized going through the book. And so I really try to read through and across periods, and even within the period that capitalism has been around, I try to show that actually capitalism has had many phases within countries, and it has varieties across countries. And so Japanese capitalism is not the same as Swedish capitalism, which is not the US form of capitalism. And so what I argue is one of the features of the system is that it is very elastic. It allows for adjustments, and maybe that's the reason why it has proved so long lasting, because it has managed to adapt to different challenges as they came across in different moments in history. And so what I'm saying there is, to many people, the fact that I wrote a book where effectively I'm arguing capitalism can be a force for good, or economic growth can be a force for good, is incompatible with the fact that at the same time I argue maybe that we need greater government involvement, that we would need some type of, we cannot, let's say, follow a completely free trade type of mantra, which again has been central to the standard view of capitalism up until very recently. We might need some industrial policy and so on. And I think that instead we have already seen all of this in different moments in history. Even just looking at the US, let's say the New Deal economy after the Great Depression was different from US capitalism in the 1980s. It doesn't mean that for a period of time the US was no longer a capitalistic country. It just means that in different moments in history you might need some greater government involvement, greater use of taxation in order to orient economic activity in a certain direction, maybe a greater use of regulation in order to achieve some of these goals. For example, banning certain technologies, thinking of internal combustion engine cars by a certain date in order to accelerate the transition in a certain direction. Might mean large public investment programs to roll out the infrastructure that allows for these new technologies to be rolled out and break technological lock-ins. And of course, in the moment in which you have a greater government involvement, then you need to finance it, so it might need greater taxation. All of these things go against one reading of capitalism, which is minimal government, minimal regulation, minimal taxation, a free trade, unfettered free trade, and so on. But that is not the definition of capitalism per se, which is just a system where most of the means of production are private, not all, and where it's a system organized around prices, which again doesn't mean that certain things are not organized around prices, where labor is free and paid. And so we will continue having those features, just adjusted in a certain direction.
Yeah, thanks. And you actually kind of made a fundamental point, which is important to the overriding argument, and that is the role of markets in capitalism in setting prices, and those prices are the basis for allocating investments. So the market is responsible for the allocation of resources with, as you've said in your version, kind of tweaks by the government to influence the decision of actors in those markets. But that's kind of a fundamental piece of your argument and kind of the importance of that market mechanism under capitalism. I had just one other question that picks up on kind of the types of government interventions, and then I'll pass back to Emily. But this is on the question of carbon pricing. You spend some time in the book discussing the role of carbon pricing. I wonder if you could maybe just elaborate on that a little bit, kind of, and why that's important to the functioning of markets and capitalism in meeting the climate challenge.
Yeah, I mean, the standard textbook, economic textbook definition of the climate problem is that we live in a market economy, as you were rightly describing. Allocation happens through pricing. which means, and so scarcity is managed through prices, which means that if something is not priced, it is not managed by the system. And so the economics understanding of the problem of climate change is, we haven't priced CO2 emissions, therefore they are an externality, if we want to use economics language, and because they're an externality, they're outside of the market mechanism, and so there has been no management of them. And so then the response to this is we need carbon pricing, because carbon pricing effectively reinserts this externality into the system, and then you can just let markets do their magic, the invisible hand do its magic, and everything is solved. I would argue, and I think it's really important, and this is, at least since the 1990s, economists were writing Nobel Prize winners were writing letters ahead of the Tokyo Protocol and so on, saying we need carbon pricing, ideally we need it at global level, and so on. So this is something that in economics has been widely mainstream for a very long time. What I argue in the book is, carbon pricing is important, and I make the point, but I wouldn't stop at that. And I wouldn't stop at that due to the fact that there are several market distortions within the system, and therefore that you will need further things. I was mentioning, for example, earlier that there are technological lock-ins, which just means that you've been using a certain technology for a long time, and therefore the whole infrastructure in society is built around that technology. To go from first principles to the practicality of it, it means that you have a gasoline station every 2 miles, you don't have an electric charging station every 2 miles. And the result of this is that even if we were to reach, let's say, price parity, so even if an electric vehicle was exactly the same price as an internal combustion engine car, you would still be locked into the fossil fuel technology. And therefore, you want to break these technological lock-ins, and you can use, I was mentioning public investment to do that, for example. I could mention finance, for example. We need, let's say, green finance or financing new technologies. There's a lot of uncertainty right now as to what characterizes green technology. And this means that because there is uncertainty and there is lack of information in the system, you're either say squandering some resources, which would mean greenwashing, or this investment is just not happening. And that's why maybe you would need governments setting a label and defining what green investment is or what contributes to a green strategy the way that countries have defined them. And that's what we call the green taxonomy in Europe. And I could go on, but just to say that it doesn't stop at the carbon pricing, but it has to go further than that. Maybe one word on the United States, which obviously has had a conversation on carbon pricing for very long. And then as a result, in the end, there was no federal level carbon pricing. There are at subnational level, some schemes of this sort. But the argument there is if you cannot, for political reasons, reach carbon pricing, you can do other things. And you can do other things like fostering innovation, green technology innovation, because that means you're making green technologies cheaper, or you're trying to accelerate that process. And at that point, the green technology is the cheap technology, and so the need for carbon pricing is somewhat alleviated.
Alessio, allow me to pick up on another topic that has received a lot of attention in the transatlantic context, not only carbon pricing, but embodied emissions in manufactured goods, or the emissions content of traded items. This has come up in the context not only of the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, but also in CBAM discussions. And it's basically the idea that together Brussels and Washington can help create the standard definition of what is a green good. And that's based on the emissions intensity during the production process. So my first question is the juice worth the squeeze when it comes to determining embodied emissions in traded goods? Is that the right conversation? Or are efforts better spent elsewhere, for example, on fossil fuel subsidy reform, which I believe is gaining more traction in the WTO system in Geneva?
So I guess to take a step back, what you're referring to is we need whether we need or not these very difficult computations of embodied carbon rests on whether you believe that we need arrangements of the sort of a carbon club, which is something that goes to what you're mentioning for the steel arrangement in the US and the EU, or whether you need a carbon border tax of sorts. And I make the argument in the book that you will need these types of arrangements. And the reason why I believe that you will is that, to my mind, the green transition will start mostly in advanced economies, or in general countries that are at an advanced technological stage and have the financial resources early stage to put the money into these new technologies and be pioneers in them, and effectively, progressively go down the cost curve, make them cheaper, and once they're cheap enough, they will spread to the rest of the world. While they're doing this, you will need some sort of carbon border taxes in order to spread this green transition also abroad to other locations. And so that's why I believe, and of course, let's say climate change cannot be fought by one or two or even only advanced economies alone. You need the rest of the world on board as well. And that's why I think that carbon border taxes will set the incentives straight, let's say, at a global level in carrying other countries on the green transition faster than would happen otherwise. And so I think that although these calculations are extremely hard to do, and I would suppose that it's going to take a long time of refining them also. We will start with something and then you will constantly be improving on the computations. I think they will be needed. But at the same time, I wouldn't exclude, fossil fuel subsidies are such a huge fundamental topic that I wouldn't want to say you've got to focus on the first and therefore you can neglect the second, because of course we were talking about carbon pricing earlier. With fossil fuel subsidies, you're doing the exact opposite. You're doing carbon subsidy instead of carbon pricing. So you're using one policy lever to make it cheaper to burn fossil fuels, while at the same time, the whole effort we're trying to do is to make it harder, more expensive, and so on to use fossil fuels so that we can switch to green technologies faster. And so the faster we can roll out, we can get rid of these fossil fuel subsidies, the better, although I realize that the political economy of it is very complex in several countries.
Okay, thank you. If I could just ask one more question before passing it back to Stephanie, I'd like to drill down a little bit on the subsidies topic that you raise throughout the book, and particularly towards the end. And there's been a lot of discussion, as I mentioned earlier, particularly coming out of Davos in the last few days about the subsidy race between the European Union and the United States. And one of my favorite takes on Twitter was, oh my gosh, as a climate person, I've been waiting my whole life for the subsidy race in the green economy. But I think that there's probably more to it than that. And the primary risk, it seems, is that it leaves out developing economies, which is also one of the main critiques of the European CBAM proposals, that they don't have a carve out for LGCs. So I'm wondering if you share the assessment that this is a positive subsidies race, or if you see certain pitfalls ahead if the subsidies are not maintained, implemented correctly, or if they overstep in certain ways and risk harming innovation goals.
This was bound to be an item of discussion, of course, given the current state of transatlantic discussions on these topics. As a general principle, obviously I don't cover any of this in my book, in the sense that the book came out just before the summer, and then of course the summer is when Inflation Reduction Act was passed. But to a certain extent, there are some elements there of prescience in the fact that I was saying, look, if you you will have to use a bit more industrial policy, especially if you cannot use carbon pricing, which seems to be the case in the United States. If you go big on industrial policy, on active industrial policy, so giving subsidies for research, for adoption, and so on, chances are you will use not only the active side, but the defensive side as well. And again, it's not an argument for the United States alone, but it's to say if you're putting a lot of money on the table, chances are that the political economy of your own country will push to make sure that this goes to your own company, workers, generating jobs, and so on. And so that the active side of industrial policy, which is the one that we like the most, lays the seed for the defensive side that we like less. The reason why I say that we like it less, and especially I think that it's unfortunate that it happens between the US and Europe, is that on the surface of it, it's good. I mean, both blocks are putting a lot of money into green innovation. And so, I mean, yes, that's a good thing. It's something that we were waiting for a long time. But if to a certain extent, if you believe in gains from trade, which I hope while realizing in geopolitical tension moments and so on, you've got to put them into context. But if you still believe to a certain extent into David Ricardo's work and of comparative advantages and the benefits from trade, you would assume that allies, so where there are no geopolitical tensions of this sort, would continue to live along the principles of you specialize in your comparative advantage, and it might be that the US becomes a pioneer in, I don't know, green hydrogen, and Europe specializes more in wind, offshore wind, and then we can trade these individual technologies, and that's for the benefit of all. And instead, what you end up having is that everybody's subsidizing everything, and it's throwing a lot of money at the problem, not necessarily in the most efficient of ways. And crucially, if you spark a subsidy war, or let's say a race of subsidies also with China, so you have the big blocks subsidizing green technologies, you're squeezing, I suspect, progressively, those countries that cannot match the bill. And so those that have less access to financial markets, that can borrow less, and so on, will end up not being able to engage in this race. And so you might have some consequences on the rest of the world, aside from these large blocks of countries that have strong access to financial markets and deeper pockets.
So, Alessio, I see we're around 20 minutes or so left, and we're getting some Q&As or Qs in for you to answer. So before we turn to the audience, let me just ask one question about the potential for a free rider problem or the potential for carbon leakage. And here specifically, the concern being that if countries or regions, the EU, the US, adopt stricter policies with regard to carbon emissions, that alone is insufficient if you still have other large emitting countries outside of that commitment. So under your vision for how the climate crisis can be addressed through capitalism, how is the free rider problem addressed? How do you kind of prevent an outcome where some countries are taking measures, but the overall global issue is not being addressed because other large economies are not?
So I think that for a very long time, economics, to a large extent, has focused on looking at climate change, of course, through the lenses of externalities, but also through the lenses of free riders and let's say climate change being a public good or the atmosphere being a public good, and therefore you have free rider problems and so on, which is why then you would need some sort of treaty and so to operate as a global community. And what I argue in the book is, look, yes, from a first best perspective, it would be ideal if we could all come to the table and all countries could agree on the ideal decarbonization strategy and perhaps do R&D together and so on and so forth. Except this is not going to happen. I argue in the book as to why this is the case. I would argue that since the book was released, the situation has gotten even worse. And so the idea that countries would just bury all hatchets and come together because climate requires it is wishful thinking. And so we live, as the saying goes, we live in a second best world at best, and we've got to deal with it. And so what this implies is that we will have to deal with climate change through national strategies, mostly loosely coordinated along the lines of a Paris Agreement. So I'm not saying, that these agreements are for nothing. It's just that we're not progressing towards a world where these agreements are going to become binding and you can have centralized decision making on climate issues at the global level. What I argue is that this can be done, and so that the free riders problem is not gonna ultimately prevent the decarbonization of the planet and reaching net zero. And to a certain extent, the reason why I say that is that the free rider problem is professed on the idea that the polluting technology is actually cheaper and therefore better, and therefore I can gain competitiveness by being smart or outsmarting others and just like sticking to my current fossil fuel technologies while the others do this expensive green transition. And I would argue that this might be the case for a very limited period of time, but there is nothing inbuilt in the technology that says that the green option must be the expensive option. And actually, we're seeing that progressively green technologies are becoming cheaper. Eventually, they will become cheaper than the fossil fuel alternative. And crucially, they're perceived as superior. So effectively, if you are trying to engage in the free rider problem, you're banking on a technology that is soon going to be perceived as old, antiquated, and inferior. And so you risk locking yourself in a world where nobody progressively is going to want your goods because they are perceived as something of the 20th century rather than of the 21st, and they're even more expensive eventually.
You bring up an important point, actually just an important observation there about kind of the trajectory for renewables prices, and even, I guess, absent additional government intervention, a trend that's seeing renewables become increasingly cost competitive with more traditional fossil fuel sources. So let me turn to some of the questions that we've gotten in from the audience. And actually the first one here, I think is a criticism that I'm sure, or a critique, I guess, that will be familiar to your ears. But the question here is would you concede that what you're presenting is a model that's more aligned to socialism, with government control, removal of socioeconomic classes, significant increase in taxes to pay for the programs, rather than a capitalist model? How do you respond to that?
I'll respond with a little anecdote in the fact that by now I've been presenting the book to several audiences, and I feel like I often get this critique, and simultaneously I get also the opposite critique, which is that I'm too much still banking on markets, and I'm still looking at capitalism as a potential force for good, and so on. So I feel like I'm in the crossfire, which might mean that I've struck the balance in the middle. But I would argue that I still see a huge role for the private sector, and I would argue that it will be eventually the private sector that leads the way on the green transition. And so in that respect, I don't see at all myself as abandoning capitalism, let alone embracing more socialist type of model. And so what I'm trying to do is just say, there's stuff that governments can do, and there's stuff that governments cannot do. Crucially, for example, the cost saving on green technologies, private sector is great at doing, not so much the public sector. Nonetheless, public sector has proved good at complementing research in R&D, in green R&D, especially for technologies that are far from market. So investing in green hydrogen, in aviation, in green steel, all these things that are not going to happen tomorrow, and probably not even in the next decade, but will take more time. Private sector is more wary. Fusion, private sector is more wary, and therefore it can be these things can be complemented by government action and some government money. When the technology will be cracked, again, it will be the private sector that is going to be great at spreading it. And so, there's the work of Marianna Mazzucato, this Italian-American economist, who says, public sector is great at doing innovation. This is particularly true more in the development phase, less in the diffusion phase. And so that's where I see, for example, the balance there.
Well, Alessio, let me get you into a different crossfire, if you will, which is about the WTO, our next audience question. Let me go ahead and read this one. The WTO system, growing out of the GATT, penalizes government interventions through countervailing duties. When governments subsidize private efforts to arrest climate change, competing governments impose tariffs. This effectively penalizes the production of goods that benefit from government involvement in combating climate change. The question is, should the WTO ban countervailing duties on climate change government programs?
Aside from the fact that there are some environmental clauses, and therefore the argument is being made that for specific elements, public security, environment, and so on, there can be exceptions. I'm banalizing and making sound something very easy, where instead probably it's going to be an escalation for lawyers, for trade lawyers in the years to come. If instead, more broadly, you're asking me whether this is going to happen or whether this is going to have repercussions, my answer would be no. And what I assume, what I expect, I don't know exactly what shape this will take, but in terms of legal arguments and how we will go about it, but I do not see the WTO arresting these dynamics on industrial policy, on the green transition, and so on, and neither in the US nor in Europe or beyond.
While we're here, if I could just abuse moderator privilege very quickly, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the idea of a peace clause within the WTO, which is the idea that countries would kind of come to an agreement or truce and basically agree not to take punitive action against each other if the pursuit is basically for the benefit of climate change. So it's a little bit different of a question. It wouldn't be a WTO tool per se, but it would be an agreement among the parties. Is that worth pursuing?
I don't. Again, if you building on what I was saying, we are effectively reshaping economies entirely. If you buy into that, I've had situations where people were saying, there's the good type of industrial policy, for example, green, because it's in the interest of the world and the planet and our future and grandchildren and so on. And then there is the bad type of industrial policy, which is on, digital, where it's a beggar thy neighbor type of dynamic, and you're just trying to get ahead. I don't see this separation. I see it as artificial. In the sense that, yes, it is in the interest of the planet and the future and so on if you do it on green, but it will also have huge economic repercussions. Cracking the technologies that will be crucial in the 21st century will imply guaranteeing prosperity for certain countries for decades to come. As I often say, many people have heard, of course, the names Daimler, Benz, Porsche, Maybach, all of these are known because they are car companies, but actually these are the names of German engineers that at the turn of the last century managed to perfect certain aspects of the internal combustion engine. What this tells us is that if you are a pioneer and you manage to crack the green technologies of the future, this is going to reverberate for decades, eventually over a century, in terms of being at the frontier of a certain technology. And I cannot expect countries just signing a peace clause and saying, we are fine with whatever you're doing, and therefore sitting back, relaxing, and seeing what this does to their economies.
I'm going to go to one of the questions that we've received with regard to measurement of carbon. And if I could expand upon it, the question is asking about the ability or willingness maybe to measure the carbon footprint of wind and solar on a like-for-like basis with different hydrocarbon-based energy solutions. I think that's an interesting question. And if I could expand upon it and just ask about the adequacy of emissions measurement in general, if you have any knowledge about kind of what is the state of emissions measurement, and is it fit for purpose if the ultimate goal here is actually reducing global emissions?
I think, to a certain extent, the carbon there are computations on the carbon content of wind and solar. You can see that it's obviously immensely smaller than alternative fossil fuel technologies for obvious reasons. I think the important point there, bringing it beyond almost the climate discussion, is the environmental footprint of some of these technologies, because of course they will require large amounts of extractions of minerals, of cement, of steel. These are physical things. They're humongous. They are in the middle of the ocean or on land and so on. So they do have an impact on the environment that is broader, and there is less awareness of that. That being said, I still think that we should move ahead while being aware of some of these aspects, and that's why they can be alleviated, and the pressure on the environment of some of these technologies can be alleviated. Wind companies are already exploring how they can, for example, recycle some of the materials, and it's important to think about it now because these technologies are experiencing exponential growth. So rather than realize that we have a problem once we're already sitting on a pile of used windmills, it's better to try and inbuild sustainability principles, circular economy principles early on rather than later. And we're seeing the same for electric car batteries, for example, again, something that is experiencing exponential growth, crucially relying on green minerals. But yes, in terms of emission measurement, it really depends. In terms of the ETS, so the way that we do carbon pricing in Europe, we're fairly happy with the way we're doing it right now. It is true that we're not applying it to the whole of the economy. ETS applies to a smaller subset of the economies. It's easier to measure carbon emissions when you're looking only at factories than whether you're looking at transport, for example. And so you would have to measure emissions on all forms of personal transport. That would be a nightmare. It doesn't apply to buildings. That would be a nightmare as well. So that's where we need to improve a lot in the way we are doing carbon measurement right now.
Right. Well, Alessio, we're pretty close to time here. I'm going to resist the temptation to ask another question because I know we're going to go over at that point. But let me just, on behalf of Emily and CSIS, congratulate you again on this book. I really do recommend the book, and you kind of comically up front urge the reader, the intrepid reader, to go into the footnotes. I would actually second that because there's a lot of very good information and very well researched backing for some of the recommendations that you make in the book. So with that, I hope that we'll see you actually in person at some point at CSIS. We'd love to continue the conversation and see where some of the proposals that you have in your book actually go. So thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to future conversations.
Thank you.